She set him up to fail in front of the entire class. But when he solved a problem even graduate students struggled with, the room saw her in a whole new light. The large lecture hall at the University of Michigan was buzzing with the low chatter of students settling into their seats, flipping through pages of worn-out notebooks, and unlocking their laptops. It was just another Tuesday morning in Professor Linda Cartwright's advanced calculus class, a class notorious for its difficulty, and for Cartwright's brutal teaching style. She was a woman who commanded authority the moment she stepped into a room. Sharp features, silver-rimmed glasses, and a no-nonsense gaze that could make even the most confident students shrink in their chairs. Her reputation was built on precision and discipline. If you wanted to pass her class, you had to earn it. No shortcuts, no sympathy. And today she wasn't in the mood for nonsense. She strode to the front, heels clicking against the tiled floor, and in one swift motion, snapped a piece of chalk between her fingers. The room fell silent. "All right," she said, brushing a stray blonde hair from her face. "Last lecture we covered multivariable limits. Today we push forward Laplace transforms." She turned to the board and began writing. Long, intricate equations sprawled across the surface in neat, perfect script. Students scrambled to take notes, some already lost in the symbols, others pretending to understand. Cartwright thrived in this environment. The struggle, the pressure, the silent competition. She knew most students would flounder, and frankly, she preferred it that way. It reinforced the idea that only the truly gifted belonged in her world. At least that's what she thought. Somewhere near the middle of the hall, one student sat quietly, tapping his pen against his notebook. He wasn't struggling. He wasn't panicking. If anything, he looked bored. His name was Daniel Reed. Tall, lean, and always dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans. Daniel wasn't the type to draw attention. He rarely spoke in class, never made a spectacle of himself. But beneath that quiet demeanor, his mind worked faster than most. Numbers, patterns, equations, they made sense to him in a way they didn't for others. He glanced at the board, eyes scanning the equation. Something was off, a small mistake, just a minor one, but a mistake nonetheless. Daniel hesitated. He could let it go. No one else seemed to notice. But then again, if she caught the mistake later, she might double back and waste time correcting it. Before he could decide, another student raised a hand hesitantly, a girl in the front row. Professor Cartwright, I think there's an error in the second line," she asked, her voice uncertain. The professor turned slowly, arching a brow. "An error," she repeated, as if the very idea was offensive. She scanned the board, then smirked. "There is no error," she said flatly. The girl's face turned red, and she quickly looked down, embarrassed. Daniel exhaled, shaking his head slightly. He hated this. The way some professors dismissed students, the way they acted as if they were beyond making mistakes. And before he could stop himself, his hand was in the air. "Actually," he said, his voice calm, "there is an error." A ripple went through the room, heads turned. Cartwright's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker, just for a second, of irritation in her eyes. "Oh," she said, arms crossing, "enlighten me." Daniel stood up, not out of arrogance, not to make a show of it. He just didn't like speaking from a seated position. "It's in the second step. You applied the transformation to the wrong term," he explained, pointing at the board. "The coefficient doesn't carry over that way. If you solve it using your method, the final answer doesn't match the expected result." Silence. Cartwright's jaw tensed. She turned back to the board, scanning her own work, and then there it was. The mistake. Her grip on the chalk tightened. For a moment, Daniel thought she might just admit it and move on, but then her lips curled into a tight smile. "Well, Mr. Reed," she said, turning to face him, "since you seem so confident, why don't you come up here and show us the correct way?" A few students chuckled under their breath. Daniel could hear the unspoken message behind her words. She didn't want to acknowledge that he was right. She wanted to put him on the spot, make him hesitate, make him stumble. But that wasn't going to happen. Daniel set down his notebook, walked calmly to the front of the room, and took the chalk from her hand. he wasn't going to hesitate. But Professor Cartwright had no idea what she had just set in motion. Daniel stepped up to the board, chalk in hand. He could feel the weight of the room pressing in, the silent expectations, the professor's gaze drilling into his back, the quiet murmurs from students, wondering if he was about to make a fool of himself. But he wasn't nervous. With smooth, deliberate strokes, he erased the incorrect part of the equation and rewrote it. His handwriting wasn't as neat as Cartwright's, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the numbers, and they lined up perfectly. He spoke as he worked, his voice even, casual. The mistake was in how the transform was applied. You carried the coefficient outside too early, which changed the integral limits. But if you solve it this way, it keeps the function intact. The room was silent, except for the soft scratch of chalk against the board. He finished the equation, set the chalk down, and stepped back. Then he turned. Professor Cartwright stood rigid, arms crossed, lips pressed together. She wasn't used to being corrected, especially not in front of a lecture hall full of students. Daniel could see it in her eyes. She wanted to dismiss him, brush it off, maybe even find a way to twist the situation so that she still looked right. Instead, she took a slow breath, nodding curtly. "Fine," she said. "You corrected it? Congratulations." Some students exchanged glances. That was it. No acknowledgement, no actual praise. Daniel didn't need it. He just returned to his seat, feeling the eyes of his classmates on him. Some were impressed, a few seemed irritated, probably the ones who thought he was showing off. But he wasn't. He just couldn't stand errors, especially ones that could have been avoided. Professor Cartwright turned back to the board, wiping away his work. "Let's move on," she said briskly. "Since Mr. Reed is so eager to contribute, I assume he won't mind another challenge." Daniel blinked. "Excuse me." Cartwright was already writing again, this time a much longer equation. It sprawled across half the board, filled with integrals, limits, and a particularly tricky differential component. She finished the last symbol with a flourish and turned to face him. "Since you have such a keen eye," she said, "solve this." A few students shifted in their seats. Daniel stared at the equation. He knew exactly what she was doing. She wanted to make an example out of him. This wasn't a normal question, not for this, a level. The complexity alone made it clear. She didn't expect him to get it right. She expected him to hesitate, stumble over the steps, maybe get partway through before realizing he was in over his head. She wanted to prove that he wasn't as smart as he thought he was. Daniel exhaled through his nose. "Fine." He stood again, walking back up to the board. A few students chuckled under their breath, clearly expecting him to struggle. Cartwright smirked, stepping back and folding her arms. "Take your time," she said. Daniel didn't need time. He picked up the chalk and started writing, not hesitating, not second-guessing, just solving. Every symbol, every number, flowed from his mind to his hand effortlessly. He didn't even pause to think. His brain was already 5 steps ahead, visualizing the solution before his fingers had finished the previous line. The room grew quieter. The murmurs stopped. Professor Cartwright's smirk faded. Halfway through the equation, Daniel glanced at her. "I assume you want the solution in terms of exponentials instead of trigonometric functions." She didn't answer. He kept going. A few more steps, a few simplifications, and then done. He underlined the final answer and turned around, casually setting the chalk back on the tray. Silence. A deep, consuming silence. Then somewhere in the back, a single student let out a low whistle. Cartwright's expression was unreadable. She scanned his work line by line, searching for an error, anything she could use to dismiss it. There was nothing. He had solved it, not just correctly, but elegantly. The solution was clean, efficient. A few students started whispering. A few, others leaning forward, clearly realizing what just happened. Daniel crossed his arms. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't gloating. He was just waiting. Professor Cartwright finally spoke, her voice tighter than before. "Lucky guess." A few students laughed under their breath, though not at Daniel. He tilted his head slightly. "It wasn't a guess." Cartwright exhaled sharply through her nose. "Sit down, Mr. Reed," she muttered. Daniel turned and walked back to his seat. He could feel the shift in the room. The way people were looking at him now. Some with admiration, some with resentment, and one person, Professor Cartwright, with something else entirely. But she wasn't done with him yet. The energy in the room had shifted. Daniel could feel it. No one was looking at Professor Cartwright the same way they had at the start of class. He hadn't set out to embarrass her. That wasn't his goal. But he also wasn't about to shrink just to make her comfortable. Cartwright turned back to the board, but she was gripping the chalk tighter now. She continued with the lecture, but her words lacked the same edge of authority they usually carried. Then, without warning, she stopped mid-sentence. She turned back to the class, scanning the rows of students, and then her gaze landed back on him. "If you're so confident, Mr. Reed," she said, forcing a smile, "how about we raise the stakes?" A few students chuckled. Others leaned forward, sensing something was about to go down. Daniel didn't react. "What do you mean?" Cartwright walked over to her desk, pulling out a thick textbook. She flipped through the pages before stopping on a section deep into the book, far beyond what they had covered in class. She turned the book around so the class could see the dense equations on the page. "This," she said, tapping a particularly intimidating problem, "is from an advanced graduate-level course. Something I wouldn't expect any undergraduate to be able to solve." A murmur rippled through the room. "But since you seem to have a natural talent for this, why don't you prove it?" She smiled, but her eyes were sharp. Daniel exhaled slowly. He could see what she was doing. This wasn't about math anymore. She wanted to break him. This wasn't a test of skill, it was a power move. She wanted to push him past his limit, make him struggle in front of everyone. Maybe he'd get part of the way through, hesitate, and then she'd step in, remind the class why she was the authority in the room. He could refuse. He didn't owe her this. But the way the students were watching him, the way some were waiting for him to back down, made his decision for him. He stood up. Cartwright's smirk wavered for just a second. Daniel walked to the front of the room. She handed him the textbook, but he didn't even look at it. He had already memorized the problem. Without a word, he picked up the chalk. He knew the strategy. She had pulled this trick before, picking something just out of reach to humble students who thought too highly of themselves. But she had miscalculated. Daniel lived for problems like this. He started writing. His movements were controlled, deliberate. The problem was tough, no question about it. But tough didn't mean impossible. As he worked, the whispers in the room faded. The only sound was the chalk against the board. He didn't rush. He let each step unfold naturally, flowing from one equation to the next. Every simplification, every transformation. It was all leading to the inevitable answer. And then finally, he boxed the final result. He turned back to the class. Silence. Cartwright's face was unreadable, but her clenched jaw, the stiff way she held herself, he knew she had thought this would put him in his place. Instead, he had just made her look like a fool, a student in... The back let out a low laugh, shaking his head. "Yo, what?" Even the students who had been skeptical were now staring at Daniel differently. Cartwright's hand twitched slightly at her side. She had to say something. She had to take back control of the room. "You've skipped a step," she said, her voice clipped. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "No, I didn't." Her fingers curled slightly. "Yes, you did." Daniel turned back to the board, scanning the work. Then without missing a beat, he pointed to a section near the middle. "This step here, where I simplified the partial fraction decomposition. That's what you're talking about." Cartwright didn't answer. He nodded. "I didn't skip it. I just did the calculation mentally because it was straightforward." The class was dead silent. Cartwright's face was tightening by the second. Daniel turned back to her. "But if you'd like, I can write it out the way he said it." It wasn't cocky. It wasn't even challenging. It was just matter of fact. And that made it worse. He wasn't trying to make her look bad. She was doing that to herself. Cartwright inhaled, sharply. "No, that won't be necessary." She turned back to her desk, setting the textbook down a little harder than she needed to. Daniel could feel the shift in the air. He had just turned the class against her. but Cartwright wasn't going to let this end here. Professor Cartwright turned back to the class, her face composed, but her grip on the desk betraying her frustration. Daniel sat down, but he knew this wasn't over. The way she stood there, her posture too stiff, her jaw too tight. She was trying to figure out her next move. The students, meanwhile, were still digesting what had just happened. Some were exchanging glances, others whispering in low voices. Then a hand shot up from the second row. Professor. A student, Brian, one of Cartwright's favorites, leaned forward. If he got it right, doesn't that mean Daniel just solved a graduate-level problem? Shouldn't that, mean something? Cartwright's lips pressed into a thin line. Brian wasn't wrong, but admitting that would mean acknowledging that she had underestimated Daniel. I never said it was impossible, she responded smoothly. Only that it would be difficult for an undergraduate. There was something slippery about the way she said it, like she was already trying to rewrite what had happened. Daniel let out a slow breath, staring at the desk in front of him. He wasn't looking for validation. He didn't need her approval. But the class did. They needed to see what was happening here. Another student raised their hand. So if he got it right, does that mean he should be in a more advanced class? Cartwright didn't answer right away. She glanced at Daniel for a moment. There was something else in her eyes, a calculation. Then finally she smiled. I think, she said, her voice softer now, Mr. Reed would benefit from an academic challenge. A few students perked up. Was she actually recognizing his talent? Was she about to suggest a higher-level placement? Daniel wasn't convinced, which is why Cartwright continued. I'd like to invite him to a little competition. The murmurs started again. Daniel frowned. What kind of competition? Cartwright walked to her desk, pulling out a folder. She flipped it open, scanning the papers inside. There's a university-sponsored mathematics symposium coming up next month. Some of the best students from different schools in the region will be competing. It's a rigorous, high-pressure environment. Not just about solving problems, but about doing it under time constraints, with an audience. She looked up, eyes locking onto his. I assume you'd be up for it. Daniel immediately understood what she was doing. This wasn't an opportunity. It was a setup. She wasn't just testing his math skills anymore. She was testing his ability to handle pressure, to see if he could perform, outside the safety of a classroom. If he failed, it wouldn't just be in front of his classmates. It would be in front of professors, graduate students, and some of the best minds in the field. He could feel the weight of the room. People were waiting for his answer. If he backed down now, it would look like he had gotten lucky today. That he wasn't actually as capable as he seemed, and if he accepted, he'd have to win. Daniel exhaled, then nodded. Once. I'm in. Cartwright's smile didn't reach her eyes. Excellent. But she wasn't finished with him yet. The news spread fast. By the time Daniel stepped out of the lecture hall, students were already whispering about it in the hallways. A few nodded at him with newfound respect. Others looked at him the way people look at an athlete about to enter a championship game. Curious, expectant, waiting to see if he'd live up to the hype. Daniel barely paid attention. He had bigger things to focus on. The symposium was in 4 weeks. That meant he had 4 weeks to prepare for a competition that people spent months, sometimes years, training for. That night, he sat in the campus library, surrounded by textbooks, notebooks filled with calculations, and a half-empty coffee cup that had long gone cold. He had always loved math, but this was different. This wasn't just about numbers anymore. This was personal. Burning the midnight oil already. Daniel looked up to see Brian standing by his table, hands in his pockets. He shrugged. Gotta be ready. Brian smirked, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. Dude, you're already ahead of half the people who compete in these things. Cartwright's just pissed that you embarrassed her. That's the only reason she threw you into this. Daniel leaned back in his chair. I know. Brian studied him for a second. So why do it? Daniel thought about that for a moment. He had asked himself the same thing more than once. He didn't need to prove anything. He could have walked away, let the moment pass. But he also knew how people like Cartwright operated. If he backed down, she'd use it as confirmation. She'd find a way to frame it, say that he was talented but not disciplined enough, intelligent but not ready for real challenges. She would make sure that's what people remembered. Daniel wasn't going to let that happen. Because she expects me to lose, he finally said, and I want her to be wrong. Brian grinned. Now that I can respect. 4 weeks later, Daniel stood in a large auditorium-style lecture hall at the University of Pennsylvania, staring at the panel of judges and the long digital timer displayed above the stage. Competitors sat in assigned seats, their desks filled with scratch paper, pens, and one simple directive: solve the problems faster and more accurately than everyone else. Professor Cartwright was in the audience. She hadn't spoken to him much leading up to this. No encouragement, no advice, just a polite nod when they arrived, as if she were a mere observer instead of the person who had thrown him into this. Daniel knew what she was waiting for. She wanted to see if he'd crack. The timer started. He didn't. The first round was mental math, solving problems without writing anything down. While some competitors hesitated, Daniel's hands moved without pause, punching numbers into the response system faster than the proctors could verify them. The second round was theoretical application, breaking down concepts into proofs. Here his natural intuition took over. Numbers weren't just numbers to him. They were patterns, rhythms, structures that built upon one another. The third round was speed solving. This was where most people tripped up. Pressure could make even the best students second-guess themselves, but Daniel thrived under pressure. He kept going, ignoring the murmurs, as his name crept higher and higher on the leaderboard. By the final round, there were only 2 competitors left in serious contention: Daniel and a PhD candidate from MIT. The last problem appeared on the screen. It was brutal. Layers of integrals nested within summations, a problem designed to test not just knowledge, but endurance. Daniel's pulse steadied. He exhaled, picked up his pen, and started writing. But what happened next, no one saw coming. 1. The clock ticked down, the final seconds stretching like an eternity. Daniel's fingers gripped the pen, his mind running through the layers of the problem faster than he could write. Every part of the equation had to be perfect. No shortcuts, no miscalculations. He could hear the faint scribbling of his competitor next to him, the MIT PhD candidate, who was just as determined. They were neck and neck, each racing to finish first. Daniel's heart pounded, but his thoughts were clear. He saw the pattern, the shortcut no one else would see, and that was it. His hand moved faster, slashing through the numbers, simplifying expressions in ways most students wouldn't even think of. He didn't need to double-check. He knew, final answer. He boxed it and set his pen down. The timer buzzed. Daniel looked up, his breathing steady. His competitor was still writing. The room was dead silent. Then one of the judges stood up, walking over to examine both answers. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. After a long pause, the judge raised his microphone. The winner of the 2025 University Mathematics Symposium is Daniel Reed. The room erupted. Some students clapped, some let out audible gasps. But Daniel didn't react right away. He just exhaled, letting the reality of it sink in. He had won, not just against the other students, but against the expectations placed on him. Against the professor who had doubted him. Against the unspoken assumptions that had tried to define him before he had the chance to define himself. Professor Cartwright was motionless in the crowd. Daniel met her gaze for the first time. She looked unsure, like she was reassessing everything. She thought she knew. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't scowling either. She gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Daniel didn't need an apology. He didn't need validation. He had let the numbers speak for themselves. The next morning, Daniel walked into class, taking his usual seat. Cartwright entered a few minutes later, just as composed as always. But this time when she scanned the room, her gaze landed on him with something different. Respect. She cleared her throat. Before we begin today's lecture, she said, I'd like to acknowledge the results of yesterday's symposium. The room fell quiet. Daniel Reed took first place in a competition against some of the best mathematical minds in the country, she continued, her voice even. That is no small achievement. A few students clapped, Brian shot Daniel a knowing grin. Cartwright turned back, to the board, and with that said, "Let's begin." That was it. No over-the-top praise, no long speech, just an acknowledgement. And somehow, that meant more than anything else. Because Daniel hadn't needed to prove himself to her. He had needed to prove something. To himself. And he had. Because sometimes the best way to change people's minds isn't through words, it's through undeniable truth. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe.